All right. Anyway, we decided to do 2 Corinthians, and um, I've kind of fallen in love with this letter. I didn't realize what all was in here, except just, what you read and studied, growing up. Let's just start with a prayer, and then we'll go on from here. Father, we just want to say thank you for coming to us. Thank you for giving us your divine grace. Thank you for loving us and for accepting us and for seeking us so that we can be your children. And because of your son's death, we can say amen. All right, last week, my focus kind of was on the narrative of why did Paul end up writing 2 Corinthians. All the most commentaries say, well, it's because there was, there's problems, the strife, this you've got people coming in saying that Paul's authority is not good. There's better people to listen to, blah, blah, blah. And so, the kind of the questions that was in the Corinthian population was, who presented better? Who is a better presenter? Who is a better speaker? Who has more status, more influence, and everything? And it's almost kind of like they were saying, who would we be more proud of to show off? Who would be the one that we say, hey, this is our guy, and so that disunity existed from over, who was going to actually, represent, their, as said, the face of the church, if you want to put it that way. And this letter, 2 Corinthians, really, I think, points out that, Paul was really hurting through all this process. And there was some anxiety and angst and fear and just not feeling good. And when you look at this, this fourth, what we call the fourth letter, there's just this avalanche of emotions. On one hand, Paul deeply loved, these wayward, Christians, and his conflict with them caused a lot of stress. It's like he was an emotional basket case in a way, when you're reading this. You had his frustration, with them also brought out this intense anger and defensiveness. And you get some of that feeling in especially chapters 10 through 13. Wrote down, imagine Paul as their spiritual parent. Think of it that way. He experiences alternating, it's like a parent, he experiences alternating desire to hug them, hold them closely, and yet just beat some sense into them. Like, where's that principal's paddle? Let me, the one with the holes in it, so I can really, really swing. They drove him crazy, yet, he loved them intensely. You can feel that through his. So, I think with that, 2 Corinthians also shows some of Paul's discouragement. He'd written, when you look at the timeline, he had written a letter initially. He had been there, of course. He had written a letter trying to say, hey, this is some problems you need to take care of. Then apparently that didn't work, and so he was delivered another letter, and he's going, come on, guys, don't tax my patience here. Let me scold you a little bit and show you what's what. This is how to be a church, and that's 1 Corinthians. Then that wasn't received very well. So he goes, okay, I've got to go and do a visit. So he goes and visit. That really didn't go well. And it was called the painful visits. And, these rebellious Christians, they didn't stop judging him, evaluating him. They didn't yield his authority, or they didn't obey his instructions on moral, and ethical living. They basically just remained, obstinate, kind of like teenagers. And really, I wonder if Paul, ever got the stomach ulcer, because his next action was to write what's called the painful letter. So, he's going through all this process with him. So how is he not discouraged? Because, don't you listen to me? And of course, the question is, why did they disregard Paul? We went over last week that, he did establish, the community. He did live with them for a year and a half. And he taught them, and he was with them as new people believed and became, let's say, awakened in the possible life of Jesus. As I mentioned, he was like their spiritual parent. So he's trying to get them to grow up, in these letters and in this visit. But yet, when he leaves the house, he goes up to Ephesus. So, he leaves the house. And so the kids are going to sit back and, the self-serving members started asserting their status of, hey, look at me, look what I can do with this gift, or look at this over here, look at that. And then some other people came in and they were exposed, to more wealthy and impressive speakers and supposed, Christian leaders. So Paul's authority and integrity came under attack. And, his influence basically was viewed as, he's got to go. He's a threat to what we're trying to do here. And we don't want him to have a voice in what we say that's going to go on. Because they discounted him. We talked about how last week, and Danny did some great slides to where, what Paul said was debunked. They said, no, we're not going to believe what it says. This is a reflection of today's society. It's debunked. And then he was canceled, by, at that painful visit, he left going, no, we're not going to listen to you, basically, or the majority said that. And they said it because, he was poor. He had to work for a living. He wouldn't take any money. So he was always under constant, persecution and suffering. He'd been multiple times, shipwrecked. And for them, that was they said, well, maybe we really shouldn't listen to him because, the gods don't think he's very important. The gods don't think he's special. So, why should we? And then we discussed a little bit about the prominence of status within the Roman culture. And Lawrence, you made an excellent point, about Paul not having the status of being connected to a visibly, recognized school of thought. And, for the Jews, he wasn't recognized as, or he wasn't under, let's say, a recognized rabbi, an approved rabbi. So he didn't have what, I'm going to call it a testimonial of character and qualities. He didn't have that. Today's parlance, it would be, so he was not able to peddle and produce a good CV, that said that, hey, I've got favored status. He'd been canceled, but, he can't do his favored status over here. So, these were very personal attacks. They're not just some simple things. They were trying to destroy him. And, Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. So just like today, you want to attack the message, you attack the messenger. To take the messenger down. And concerning politics, and like today, concerning politics, social structure, kids, morals, religion, unless, you're the favored group, if you're not in that group, then anything you say, will be disregarded and you're engaging in disinformation. Your truth is being fact checked by some amorphous person over here that has no clue what you're trying to say. But and we are today being debunked. Us from a religious standpoint, people say, oh, you're just a bunch of hypocrites over there. And even now we're getting to where, as Christians per se, we're being called a lot worse. And it's not, we're finding ourselves moving into a place where things are not going well. and won't go well for us. And I thought about it and it says, I never realized that the cancel culture, had been around so long. Yeah, I mean, it was alive and well. It was established. It was going strong 2,000 years ago. And in reality, it's been going on for a long time. But I mean, what we're experiencing today is what Paul was experiencing during this time. And so when our integrity and reason, for being, is being debunked or being attacked, canceled, we've got a couple of things. We can either ignore what's happening and just walk away. And Jesus does say that, and if anyone, this is back, I didn't write the reference, I think it's Matthew. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, this is when he sends out, that big group. If they don't listen to you, receive your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave the house or that town. So that's one option. The other option is to actively engage. Does anybody else have any other options that you think of? Is there an in-between option?
Just disengaging means ignoring it.
Yeah, disengaging is ignoring. Yeah, basically you try to ignore it. Well, Paul was not one to walk away. At least in this circumstance, he was thrown out a lot of times. He was nearly killed a lot of times. When he decided it's the best choice to leave. But in this situation, he did not walk away. Last week, I read all of chapter 4 because I just liked it. And so in essence, this is Paul's, well, before I get to that, I guess the loaded question is, how do we defend ourselves today to others? Somebody says something about religion, about God. Do we challenge? Do we engage? We said, so why do you say that? How far do we go into, let's say, a confrontation? Because in a way, it is a confrontation because you're challenging somebody's definition. You're challenging somebody's truth that they hold. You ask a question?
Yes.
What's the question?
Whatever the issue is, instead of making a.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and move up here.
Is it guys to hear? I'm not loud enough. No. It's on the computer. They're at home. They can't hear.
No, I can barely hear you. I'm only 3 rows away. Of course, I'm nearly dead.
I have learned lately, after the last several months, about asking a question instead of making a blatant statement. It can be just asking the question can make the other person think instead of becoming defensive. They can think about their own stance and why.
It's good.
I like that too. My comment was very similar. One is, I'm not sure conversations work. I think relationships work. So if someone, I don't know, is doubting because Christians are hypocrites, maybe you just double down on how you love them.
I've talked about in the past the, dyads of anger, fear. Whenever we're confronted, sometimes we can be afraid to engage. And so because we don't know what's going to happen. And so it's easier to not engage. If we do engage, sometimes the other people, look at it as a response in anger, because we're challenging them. And I like the idea of asking a question, because instead of maybe coming from that energy of semi-anger, it's coming from this energy of vulnerability, of saying, well, let me learn. What is it that I don't know? Let me be vulnerable to hear what you have to say. And I'm not going, I'm not going to yell at you. basically. In chapter 4, this is the first 5 verses. Paul's response to this question, in essence, of his authority of who he is, of being canceled. The whole 2 Corinthians is his response. He's looking at, what is my truth? Paul kind of starts out in verse 1. He goes, I'm going to tell you a very simple truth. Interpretation is you can't cancel God's mercy and new covenant message. It's not possible. He writes, therefore, since God in his mercy has given us this ministry, we do not lose heart. Instead, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not practice deceit, nor we distort the word of God. That's how we have to approach what's going on today. We don't do deceit or distort anything. On the contrary, by open proclamation of the truth, we proclaim ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. It's like he's saying, can you not see the truth I'm saying? It says, on the contrary, by open proclamation of the truth, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience, in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled for those who are perishing. Then in verse 4, he continues, the God of this age, of Satan, has blinded the mind of the believers, or blinded the mind of believers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. I think now in modern definitions or modern terminology, I think what Paul is saying, and I quote a general multiple years back when he says, you can't fix stupid. He can put it out, he can put the truth out, but it's like, some people are going to be blinded. It's going to happen. You can't fix stupid. So, because of this truth, Corinthians, what you and I have, this truth is beyond our problem. But he says, for we do not proclaim ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's a loaded statement, for the Corinthians. For them to really say, and us, Jesus Christ is Lord, means there's a lot of change that goes on in our life to really follow that statement. And of course, he continues with the last part of that verse is, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. So he's saying, here's the life of Jesus. And because of that, we are your servants. I am your servant. And if you go back to end in chapter 13, he kind of bookends this by saying, for we cannot do anything against the truth, but only for the truth. And I like that. The idea that, hey, good lights. And so let there be light. And of course, Paul talks about that also. But anyway, but he's saying, if we proclaim the truth, some people will see it, some people won't. Some people will cancel us. Some people will debunk us, and they'll try to disparage us and erase us, basically. But we can't do anything about that. We can only give ourselves over to be service to Christ to help you. And kind of like that's where Paul starts in the second chapter. In the middle of the second chapter, Paul starts into what I call his defensive service, or how to be a servant. He gives thanks to the God of mercy as he depicts himself as being a captive slave to the Lord and conquering Jesus while being led in a procession of triumph. And of course, that just throws everything upside down for the Corinthians, because if you're a Roman citizen, you've seen processional triumphs, the conquering, general comes through. He's won all this stuff. He's, captured the king, or, all these different important people. And he's made them slaves, and he has them in chains, behind his, rhetoric, behind his himself and his other, generals and leaders. And he's exhibiting, this is the spoils of war. Well, as we talked about this, we've talked about this as a church before. The idea is that Paul's saying, I'm going to be one of those slaves. I'm like that. I'm going to be one of those captives. But the difference is, it's not saying I'm going to be a captive. I am going to be captivated by this king, by this processional triumph. And I like that thought, of being captivated, because it is by choice. I choose to do this. These guys didn't. I choose to do this. So, for Corinthians, when he says this, it's kind of like, what? What are you talking about? It's this paradox, that he's thrown up. And as you read, chapters 2, 3, and 4, and 5, you can almost say, okay, we are captivated. And when we're captivated, we are rooted in glorious righteousness. And he says we have confidence from God, not ourselves. And he says, where the Lord is a spirit and gives life, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. So I'm captivated and I get freedom. Kind of throws in a thing. And he says our message is one of reconciliation. We are a new creation. And again, these points are all made in chapters 2 through 7. And in a way, he's saying, this is the point. This is what true Christian leadership looks like. It's not about status or self-promotion or looking good. As we know, it's all about serving. And that's all the problems that Paul lists. He opens up and says, this is how I'm serving. This is how I try to serve you. And by using this triumph procession and choosing to be in it, Paul is saying, I'm not here to be impressive. You're trying to find people that are impressive. I'm not here to be impressive. My job is to point to the one who is. That's what I'm here to do, is to help you see that. As a parent, help you grow up and see that. And so in saying this, Paul is saying that when the Corinthians elevate these different people to a higher status, to a higher level, to somebody who is important, it's like, no, you're betraying Jesus. You're betraying the concept of Jesus. You're betraying why Jesus died. And you're accepting a system that is distorted. It's not based on service. Yours is based on status, but Christ is based on service. And your problem is not with me. Your problem is that you don't understand Christ. You don't understand the truth. So when you, again, read through chapters 2 through 7, Paul is talking about this paradox that he's presented to them. And the paradox is, if you're going to sit back and choose to be a pointer towards somebody who's impressive, that means you're going to have to transform yourself. You're going to have to be a new creation to do this. And then, a lot of what he talks about is this is how to be a new creation. He says, look, Jesus' glorious exaltation, as Lord and King, takes place through his suffering, his execution, and his death. It is only through this, through him suffering, is this possible. On the cross, of course, Jesus revealed God's salvation by dying for the sins of the world to reconcile, you, Corinthians, to him, so you can be redeemed to him. The cross does more. It shows God's character. Shows him being as self-giving, and suffering love that turns, actually, it's a suffering love that seeks to pull back his children. You know, we're using this metaphor of Paul being the father figure. You know, God seeks to return to his children. It also reveals a new cruciform way of life. And in 1 Corinthians, it's one of Paul's mantras. Hey, I preach Christ crucified. And he's bringing that idea over here. Paul's goal is that his life and ministry imitates the cross. You know, and this imitation is the ultimate giving of oneself. Christ ultimate, you know, he gave himself. Paul says, I give myself. And I wrote a note that says, Paul argues that his selfless ministry is determined by the ultimate manifestation of selflessness. I mean, that's the whole story of the cross. I want you to go back and read Danny's, was it Devotional 14? I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday. Where you talk about Philippians. And what Danny says fits so well in here. It's like I almost want to read it. But it's like, you know, he's saying, you know, my life is determined by this ultimate manifestation, you know, of unselfishness. And so think about that when you go back and read this devotional. Now, bottom line summary of all this is Paul is writing that his way of life and leadership, you know, he's established into his way of life that they deem not too savory, you know, and his leadership, which they question, I said, is the actual proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. He said, you know, it's written on your hearts. I've done this for you. You see what I've done. You know, and when I read this, or when I wrote all this, you know, that he effectively represents the crucified and risen Jesus, I think of myself and I go, okay, that raises the question, how authentic am I? Yeah, I take the fifth. You know, sometimes I see myself going along to get along. You know, I think that's one of those options that we do. I know I do sometimes. I don't want to be in the middle of something. I just go along to get along. But of course, Paul doesn't do that. You know, chapters 1-7 is saying, I don't do that. But again, Paul doesn't stop. You think he would, but he doesn't stop. You know, he still has 5 more chapters in him. You know? And in chapters 8 and 9, you know, he writes these because, you know, he knows that the Corinthians still need to transform and embrace, you know, this upside down paradox that he introduced in chapter 2. So in chapters 8 and 9, he addresses the case and the problem, the topic of forgotten generosity. You know, the Jews in Jerusalem fallen in on a famine. You know, they were starving, they were hungry, they didn't have money to buy anything. So Paul was raising money among the churches that he had established, saying, hey, let's take care of our brethren. Let's show our unity in God and God's mercy by helping these others out. You know, all the other churches had done and congregations had done, you know, pretty well in giving. You know, he said giving beyond their means. You know, the Corinthians, though, they had started this, and, you know, Paul talked about it in chapter 15 or 15, I think, in 1 Corinthians. But they had stopped saving because of, you know, the conflict they've had with Paul. And so he says, I need to get this started. You know, and for Paul, this isn't about money. In other words, he's saying it's another sign that you have not been transformed by the gospel of Jesus. You know, this is, you know, which at its heart, you know, this gospel is a story of sincere generosity. And he states that in chapter 8, verse 9. He says, for you know the generous, sincere grace of our Lord Jesus, the Messiah, that even though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. You can go back and read Danny's devotional. Number 14. I'll plug another ad for him. Paul is telling the story of the gospel through economic metaphor. He sits back and he says, Jesus went and gave up his glory, gave up his honor, gave up his status. In other words, his wealth, so that he could come and suffer and die on the cross like the lowest of the low. Talk about being canceled. Here Jesus was a week ahead of time, riding in on a donkey with palms out, with everything wonderful. And then, boom, he's on the cross, nailed to a tree, as they say. So Paul is saying that to be a Christian is to let the story of Jesus sink deep into our mind, our heart, and come to know the real riches of God's freely given grace. Letting this grace transform us into someone more sincere, more willing to share our resources and divine life, and helping others. And that was when I look out, see you guys on Zoom. That's what this congregation does. I've been in congregations where sometimes that's attempted. We do this here. I think we do know how to serve. And I think Paul would be happy here. I think he enjoys. I also think that's why Paul wrote the 2 Corinthians and all the stuff that he went through. I think he was hurt, going back all through the turmoil of his Corinthian experience. He's waiting for the real transformation of them and for them to move in the house of God. And when he talks about the new covenant in chapter 5. He basically says, as Jesus has given all for mankind, us for himself, he has given his all to the Corinthians. He really loves them, and he has given his all. And as Jesus's grace seeks a response to life, do we choose life? Do we choose to walk behind him? Do we choose to point to him and say, this is the one? Paul also seeks a response to real life, from the Corinthians. In this letter, he opens up his heart, his soul, not only as a defense toward those that oppose him, but also in showing the Corinthians that all he is and he has given to them so that they have, and they are given the opportunity to live Jesus's divine life. Because he writes at the end, be of one mind. Be of one mind. All that Jesus gave, and all that he had, he gave everything, and he's saying, all that I have is yours because I do not lose heart. I love that phrase. And in essence, when I, finished the letter, it's like, okay, Paul's fighting for his kids. And that's the way I can look at it. All right. I've got a second. Anybody want to say anything? Any questions? David talked about rabbit trails and about looking at something and going down rabbit trails. And when we were talking over lunch, trying to figure out how to approach what we want to do, how do we want to divide it up, all the logistics, I kind of kept thinking, thing popped in my mind that said, I wonder if I can really go down the rabbit trail of something that Jesus said. A man had two sons. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is, there's some correlation. It's a stretch. It's a rabbit trail, but there's some correlation in here. We know that, the son wanted his possessions. In other words, here he's living with his father. He's living in, let's say, the spiritual estate, and he's enjoying being here, but he's kind of like these, oppositional Corinthians. I want to do what I want to do. I want my status. I want my stuff. I want my share. I want to be important. So he gets that from his father and goes away. Well, he leaves the spiritual gift, this infusing gift of life. And so what does he do? He goes to a far country. And of course, Dave was, chasing rabbit trails on Greek translations. Well, you look at, this far country, it's called Kora Makra. I'm going to go to the Kora Makra. And if the base kind of definitions of that, is kind of a far, it can be a far country, but it can be an empty area. Sometimes it's referred to as, sometimes it feels, anyway, it's out. There's not a lot there. Now, of course, we know that he went and spent all his money. So, he was somewhere where it was people. So that's why they just said a far country. But the idea is that this is a core marker. We go out into a diminished life. And with the son, it was all about me. I want me. I want my share. I want this. I want that. And so, the Corinthians, it's like, I want my gift. I got this guy. I got this, And so he's saying, you guys, you've gone out into the core mantra. You've gone out in this area. Don't. You're not transformed. Now come back. Of course, we know that the son finally understands, that he's in an economic relationship over here. That's why I like Paul doing the economics on this one. He's in an economic relationship over here. He's going, look, I'm going to hire myself out as a pig tender, even though I'm a Jew, because at least I can get paid something. So he's not getting a gift of anything. He's not getting, anybody's taking care of him. His sustenance is coming from what his work is. But he goes, I can go back to my dad and I can be here in this estate. I can be a slave. In other words, I will choose to be a slave. I will choose to be a servant. Kind of like Paul saying, I choose to be in this triumphal possession. I'm going to choose. I'm going to go back. And of course, we know, the father run into him. We know the idea of him putting a ring on his finger. That concept is being reconciled. The ring on the finger, kind of looking at the aspects of we're in a wedding procession. We're going to be married, to our Father. We're going to be in this relationship. So it's almost a wedding ring of the relationship. We're going to be included. And it far surpasses, the kid's idea of what he was going to experience when he got in. Paul's trying to say, listen, you don't understand what's going to happen if you really let go and really transform into what is in essence the understanding of God's grace and the gift of God's grace. Because it's the giving of God's grace that we are given more. It's a circle. And then that's where, the other son comes in. He's there in the estate. He's with the father. He's being given the gift, but he doesn't get it. He goes, complains to his dad. Hey, why are you doing this for this? Why are you doing this for that? Why? In other words, he's still living, even though in the estate, he's there in his own core makra. He's there in his own little world. because he's under a economic relationship. He's not under a spiritual relationship of getting a gift and giving it away. He's going, hey, I'm your slave. I do this. I do everything you command. In other words, he's going linear down the line of going, here's this or this or this or this. In other words, I'm in a contractual agreement, almost like Paul talks about in the Old Testament. I'm under a contractual agreement. If I do this, you do that. He doesn't look at it as the new covenant as being, there's nothing we can do to get the grace. And that's why I liked at the very end of the parable, the father pleads with him, says, don't you understand that all I have is yours? And that's why I, in a way, wrote this last two lessons to try to emphasize the idea of, don't you understand that all I have is yours? It's what Paul's saying to the Corinthians. All I have is yours. I've done everything for you. Come accept the gift of grace from our Father. That's all I want from you. Because if you do that, then you and I, he writes, you and I will be together up there with our Father. I've just really come to like 2 Corinthians. Anyway, thank you. I got to run down my rabbit trail. Okay, thanks.